Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so excited to be joined by the fantastic Kerry Godliman to talk all about her current TV series, Whitstable Pearl. And I actually wanted to ask you about those opening frames and the first scene in which we see you in the show, because your character is out on her boat and there's not necessarily dialogue, and yet at the same time, we get such a sense of her as a character, even in just those first few frames of the show. And so I was interested in how you thought about the way that you wanted to bring your performance and a lot of character elements into those first few moments, even before you have interactions and dialogue to lean into.
Funnily enough, the director did have a storyboard for that opening sequence, which he showed me. And it was just that sense of isolation, that she was just alone, and that it does establish Pearl as a character, that she is a woman who can handle a boat. So I already thought, right, this is someone outside my frame of reference. She's got nautical skills. And she's alone in the world in a way. She's kind of out, exposed. Those drone shots of her in the sea, alone in that boat. It's meant to be eerie, and it's meant to create a sense of isolation. And I think it does establish the character and the show pretty well straight from the top.
And then obviously one of the first things that happens to her as a character is the unfortunate finding a friend's body in the water. Yeah. And I was interested in how, not only in the moments where the storyline is dealing with that in that first episode, but following that, how you wanted to continue thinking about the emotional impact and the effect that that has her throughout the entire series.
Definitely it scares her, it shocks her. I mean, she has a real hunger for being a detective, but I think in that storyline, and that is the spine storyline that runs through the six, Vinnys' death, that's the one that really upsets her and shocks her. And I think she puts on a front that she can handle it, because she so wants, her ambition is to be a detective, so she obviously realizes that she's going to have to put on a front and be able to handle all these different situations, and albeit some of them gory. But actually Vinny's death and Vinny's body that she's met with is really upsetting, because he's like a childhood friend, and she's someone that he's someone that she has a deep connection with, and there's a family connection. So it's way more upsetting than her just seeing a stranger's body. So yeah, that does kind of impact quite dramatically on her storyline.
I was also interested in a lot of the backstory for her as a character, and whether you found the books were actually a really valuable tool to fill in some of the gaps for her backstory, her family history, that maybe doesn't come into the show until a little bit later on.
I read the first book, but actually I did stop there, because all the very key elements to Pearl's backstory I was able to get from Julie, the writer, the novelist. And also, sometimes if you get overly absorbed in a piece of literature, it can give you a bit of a bum steer when you're sort of building a character in your own head, because I had to kind of create her for myself, and I had to, find her for myself. So sometimes if you get overly absorbed in a literary characterization, it can get in the way a little bit.
And as well as running a detective agency within the town, she also runs a restaurant, which means she probably has very little spare time running both of them. And I know that you had some chefs who were coming in and just working with you on things like the paring knives and how to move around the kitchen and to move with the food. And so how are you thinking about the overall way in which you handled a lot of the food, but even just the intrinsic nature of moving around that space, because that's somewhere that she spends hours every single day and essentially crafted from the ground up.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. I mean, it did have to be authentic. So I was glad that we had those chefs on hand, just to make it seem natural. And like you say, it's got to be convincing that it's a woman that works in a kitchen. But yeah, that's part of the job, I suppose. Same as handling a boat. You just got to make it look like you've done it a trillion times.
No easy feat. We also get a sense very early on that this is a community where everybody knows each other, and in particular, she's someone who knows every single person that she walks past on the street, and, probably grew up next door to them and has known them since they were kids. Well. And so, when you're playing a character with that level of history, even with someone that you only have a very short scene with, how do you really work on constructing a lot of that backstory and that history of that relationship, and figuring out what all of those multitude of dynamics are going to be with everybody around her?
I don't know, really. You just do it instinctively. It's not a hugely sort of cerebral or formulaic approach. I mean, for example, with the scenes with Kathy Tyson, we did it a few times, and then we chatted between takes saying it's probable that these two have had a couple of nights out and maybe fallen out and maybe were in separate years at school, or that their paths have crossed and they're not mates, but they, like you say, they both are from the same town and they've got a bit of history. So we occasionally sort of brought it up between characters, but I suppose you just imbue it in the acting, really. That's it's all present in the writing anyway. There's often throwaway lines where it's clear that there's a bit of history with all these people.
And she also has an incredibly close family relationship, you know, particularly raising her son by herself as well. And so what are the unique aspects that you really wanted to bring forth to the family dynamic, given that there is that real intimacy and closeness between them all?
I mean, we all just recognise that the script had a lot of warmth and that there is a closeness between them all, but there's also secrets between them all as well, which is kind of, as the story unfolds, you discover more about Pearl and Dolly's relationship. Yeah, and her and her son are close, but in sometimes that way, single parents have, you know, she's had to be absent a lot as well. She's had to work and raise him on her own. So there's a lot of complexity to their relationship.
Yeah, I wanted to also talk about, is it Oystein Karlsson, who's the writer of the show, because he wrote all of the scripts and was set to direct some of the episodes, but then because of COVID wasn't actually able to come over and be on site for location. But were you actually able to have any?
He didn't write all of them. He wrote a couple of them.
Were you able to have many conversations with him and the rest of the writing team before diving into production to really ask them questions about Pearl as a character and a lot of the details that go beyond what the scripts give you?
Yeah, no, we did have a chat on the phone, and he was very open to taking it, you know, how we saw it go. I mean, it evolved quite organically. There's the books, and then I think at one point there was talk of it being kind of Scandi noir, but actually when we came to do it, I don't know if it does fit that genre, really. It's something, I don't know, it's quite uniquely British in a lot of ways as well.
And you know, you obviously were incredibly immersed in being on location to shoot, but again, there were the limitations with COVID and not being able to spend much time, you know, sitting in a local bar and just getting that sensibility. But what were some of the details that you really found came into play for you with the show once you were on location in that specific town and really saw the space that you were going to be immersed in for shooting?
It did. I mean, even from the get-go, we knew that Whitstable was going to be a character almost in the show. I mean, it's a kind of interesting town because it's not picture postcard. It's, you know, there's a concrete factory right on the front. So actually it's quite an industrial town, but it's also, you know, old, and it's got lots of little alleys and it's pretty, and, you know, it's in a bit of a bay. It's not kind of out to sea. You can see, I think, Southampton on the other side of what, you know, what is it, a cove or a bay or something like that. And then when the tide's out, all those oyster farms are really visible. And so that it's not got a pier and a Ferris wheel and arcades. It's not that sort of town. I think a lot of people associate British seaside towns with that kind of kiss me quick sort of vibe, but it isn't that. It's an industrial working town. And also it's got quite a bohemian arty scene as well. It's all, I don't know how long that goes back. It certainly goes back as far as I can remember, a fair few decades, where there's been kind of a bit of a kind of alternative scene down there, you know.
I also wanted to talk about the character DCI Mike Maguire, because the show somewhat becomes a two-hander between the two of them. And there is obviously that really classic history of British double-handers, detectives in a small town. And what I loved about the relationship is that there are certain obvious differences between the two of them, but there's also a lot of similarities between them as well. And so I just wanted to ask about some of the ways in which you were thinking about what you wanted the similarity in these two characters to be, in the way that they start to draw each other out of their shells.
I think, well, both of them really enjoy being detectives and doing detective work. And one of them does it professionally. And one of them, you know, he's a police officer. And she, I think, probably has a bit of imposter syndrome, but she's a private detective. So, you know, there's obviously a slightly different background for that. And that allows her to be a bit more maverick. Like she might turn a blind eye to things that he can't because he's the law. So I think they have that in common, and they have that, you know, in opposition. And he's probably takes it all a bit for granted, and she is irritated by how much he takes it for granted, because it's something that really she wanted all her life, and she had to give it up when she had her son. And now that she's getting to do it, she really wants to do it well, and she wants to help people. And he seems to somehow almost resent it. I mean, he's got a lot of other stuff on his mind as well, and for him, you know, he's grumpy. She's more impassioned, I think.
As the series progresses and they spend more time with each other, did you find that you were also thinking about aspects that she would absorb into her own style, the way that she would be looking at information and potential clues just from working alongside him and seeing his approach to work at all?
Well, I think she recognised that he was a professional and she could probably learn a lot from him. But also, on the other hand, like I just said, he could learn a lot from her, because she would approach things with a bit more compassion or warmth for some of the people, or not make assumptions about people. He would tease her and say, you know, just because you know everyone, or you went to school with someone, or you know someone's mum, it doesn't mean you know them. You know, people are complicated and they could have secrets. But she's, you know, her pushback is, but I do know them. I do have a connection with this town, and I do know more than you about these people.
And there's also a bit of a nonlinear romance starting to show itself between the two of them.
Yeah.
They open up a little bit more and show their vulnerability to each other. And I love the way that it doesn't feel very traditional. It's not, there's an immediate spark, we're going on a date, will they, won't they? You know, there is that huge level of professional respect that you were just talking about. And so what are the ways in which you really wanted to gradually tease that out between the two of them and think about that rapport?
We did have to pace it, because I think you're right, it isn't all in one hit right at the top. I think there's a real kind of dance between them. Like, there's a sort of irritation initially, and then a kind of curiosity, and then a kind of a bit of flirting, and then someone gets hurt, and then they, you know, it really does have a lot of beats. And we did have to be very mindful of pacing that. Like, if we were working on a scene, because obviously scenes are shot out of order, so sometimes we'd have to go, right, okay, this is ep4, so where are they at in ep4? Okay, well, this has happened and this has happened. Okay, maybe they're, you know, closer now, or there's more warmth now, or the guard's down, or the guard is up, or it was just, it was a bit of a dance. We had to time it all.
And as they're investigating cases, there's obviously information which is gradually trickling in, and it's not just to do with conversations that she has with people and questions that she asks. It's looking around her, you know, suddenly seeing something across the street that sparks, okay, this must be the case, and I've just figured out this detail and piece of information, you know. And then there's also gut instinct. So would you find that you were consciously thinking beyond the lines of dialogue and thinking about other details like her gut instinct, the things that she would be looking at in her surroundings, to figure out how much information does she have and how much does she know at any point in the story?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, often it was just about pacing her knowledge, and, you know, how when's appropriate to look overtly curious. I mean, there were jokes where I was like, oh, she's really nosy. Like, she's always sort of lurking in door frames and peeping around corners and stuff like that. So, yeah, it was about kind of just naturalizing her, on the one hand, curiosity, on the other hand, nosy bonking around. But it's always driven. My feeling was that her character was someone who wanted to straighten wobbly lines. She wanted messy things to be tidied up. That's how I saw her. It was just a kind of, when there is a riddle, she wants it straightened out, and that's how I kind of played it. It was just, I can't bear disorder, I need order. I need people to feel that there's justice and that there's answers, and that there are no secrets, that we can't have secrets, we have to have everything out. So that's how I just sort of played it, really.
But there's also a real warmth in the way that you play her. And even when she's having conversations with someone and essentially trying to get a certain piece of information out of them, the way that she's able to get them to open up to her is the fact that she has this real warm energy. Was that something that you made as a conscious choice, or did you just...
I made this conscious decision that I'm, in her head, she's helping people, that she's helping them to help themselves. And even if they're guilty of a crime or a misjudgment or an error of judgment, that ultimately it's better to just be honest about it. And Pearl has a kind of moral compass that I suppose she imposes on all the people she encounters.
And one of the scenes in particular that I wanted to ask you about was that very early scene in which there's another character who essentially dunks her in the water and takes her underneath. And I was interested in the choreography and the process of how that scene came together, and also working in collaboration with your stunt double for it.
Well, it was, I don't know if I'll be getting anyone into trouble, but it was chaos. because it was choreographed and there was a stunt double, but in the end I ended up doing everything that the stunt double did, because it's quite hard if you're acting and there's, you know, you're in the moment and all the rest of it, and then you couldn't just sort of stop, and so we kept going, and it was I felt safe. I didn't really feel at any point that I was in danger, but afterwards the director said, well, you did everything the stunt double did, so we'll just end up using your shots.
And the entire show is really taking us on this entire journey through Pearl's perspective. We learn pieces of information when she learns them. We don't know anything that she doesn't know as a character. Yeah. And is that something that really came into play in a lot of the blocking of scenes and the directing, so that we could, you know, gaze across the street as she gazes across the street?
I guess so. I didn't really think about that. That was more the director's decision. But yeah, I guess that's true. You don't really, it is all from Pearl's point of view. So yeah.
And is it David Caffrey who was the lead director? And so I was interested in working with him and the rest of the directors, and particularly when you were shooting the first episode, because everybody's trying to figure out what is the visual aesthetic of this going to be and how are we going to tell the story. And so I just wanted to ask about working with David and the rest of the directors on finding that voice of the show.
There was a lot of talk about that, and I must say I'm really happy with the way it looks visually. I think it's got a really strong aesthetic to the whole thing, because especially when you get those drone shots that, you know, you there's a kind of, and we shot in deep winter as well, like we shot like in January and December, and there's a kind of grayness that's very unique to British, you know, the British weather and climate, and obviously the color scheme is very greys and blues and quite stark, but also, like I was saying earlier about that British seaside tradition, even though they did, as I said, it isn't a kind of holiday destination, they did still want that kind of pop of color. And especially with the second director, John, there were lots of, like, we were in like a fish and chip shop for one scene, and they had, because it was meant to be, it's Christmas time, and there's all these like quite sort of almost retro garish sort of Christmas decorations on this quite drab chippy. So I think I really liked that aesthetic, that it sort of looked like a painting. They're like hoppers or something, like they're just like these kind of interesting aesthetic, and the way that it was all put together, you could freeze it, and there was a lot of symmetry used for a lot of the shot composition, and I really like the way it looks. I must say I'm really pleased with it.
And on a separate note, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work in the comedy world, and in particular looking at a lot of the topical weekly shows and panel quiz shows that you end up participating in, because I was really interested in, when you're going on a show, whether it's something like 8 out of 10 Cats or, you know, Mock the Week, what that really looks like in terms of the preparation before you arrive on set, or even just the preparation that happens before the cameras turn on, and how much information they're able to give you in advance about the flow of the show beyond the format itself and structure that's obviously already in place.
You prep a lot for those shows. I mean, in the end, you film for, I think Mock the Week we filmed for like nearly 3 hours, over 2 hours anyway. They're long, and they cut it down to 30 minutes. So once that starter gun goes, it goes fast, and you're rattling through a lot of subjects, and you're trying to keep the pace and the energy up, and you want to get all your jokes in, and you have been given a bit of a steer the day before on what the stories are going to be. So you've had to have thoroughly read all the news stories, mining it for jokes, and also not only have your pre-written jokes, but of course you want to be present and in the moment. And if something comes up, you want to be able to retort, you know, in the present, and not be looking down and waiting for your line. And it's I always think it's like that hopscotch game with ropes. That's how I see panel shows. It's like a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it's like DJing. You've just got to keep all those skills up and open, really.
But there's also a real art form in terms of taking the information at hand. Say there's a news story that you're making jokes about, and really playing with that information. But then there's times in which the comedy is allowed to push further away from that topic. And there's an art of how far can you take it? How long can you take it outside of that? Is that something that evolved for you and you felt like was one of the learning curves when you started doing a lot of those shows, or did it come very naturally?
A bit of both. I'm obviously, the first time I did a couple of, like, the first time is terrifying, because it has to be, there's no way around that. but once I got into my groove, I did realise that actually when I started watching a few episodes back that I'd been in, I started to notice that a lot of what made the edit, what the producers decided to keep, was things that actually I said off the cuff. So I did need to kind of lean back and not be leaning too forward. Often these shows have a reputation for being not very, that people aren't listening to each other, but my experience is that they very much are. They're really listening to each other, because if someone leaves a door open, another comic will just push it wide open and lean into a joke. And then even better if someone else bounces off that, and even better if you get a call back off it 5 minutes later. And sometimes things that could never have been pre-written or pre-planned can become a running joke through the whole show.
And in terms of stand-up, you've done such a multitude of shows, and one of those being Live at the Apollo. And when you stepped into hosting Live at the Apollo, what was the difference for you? Because then it's not just about the comedy and the narrative that you're constructing on stage. You're also really setting the tone and setting the energy for every other comedian that comes out. And so did you find that there was a bit of a shift and an evolution in hosting that?
Yeah, I did actually. And I felt quite honoured to be asked. And I wanted to do a service to the other two acts on the bill, one of which is a mate, actually, Susie Ruffle. So I really wanted to put on a good show. But the lovely thing about having done it, that was my third time, is also by then you've got a bit of shorthand. So the first time you do it, you've got to come out and prove yourself. But by the third time and hosting, people kind of are a bit more familiar with you, and they've got a bit more trust. So you can kind of relax a little bit more and take your time and not have to be, so you can be a bit more of a host and try and create a bit of a vibe in the room before you bring the acts on. I really enjoyed it, actually. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. The audiences for Live at the Apollo are some of the best audiences in comedy. They're just so up for it.
And jumping back to Whitstable Pearl, looking back at that experience and the fact, I mean, you've been in so many fantastic projects, but with playing this particular character and with this project, what are the biggest things that you feel like you came away learning about your craft as an actor from working on the show?
Well, I'd never played a lead before, so I learned a lot. I mean, I'd never been in so much of a show. I've always played lovely guest leads or had less to do, so it was a big deal for me to play Pearl. She, her name's in the title, so I was like, oh, okay, better not screw this up. But actually I found that as time went on, and once I got into the groove of it, I became quite absorbed by that world and by her, and just finding a nice balance between her vulnerability and her hardness, that I think initially people think, oh, Pearl, there was a lovely line, again, Kathy Tyson had, where she said, never made a mistake in your life, have you, Pearl? And I think she likes to give off that she's a coper and that she is, a strong person. But what I really enjoyed finding with her characterization is her vulnerability and fully exploring that, and when to reveal that, when to show it. That became quite interesting to find that shading with her.
Well, I really loved the first couple of episodes and can't wait till the entire series comes out. And thank you so much for this great conversation, Kerry.
Oh, it's a pleasure.